All right, what's happening, people? It's your boy, it's your boy Jason Muse, aka the Black Muse. I'm here with another episode of the Black Muse podcast. And I got a lot of things going on right now. I got food here. I'm sipping a little something. It's Monday Night Football going on. It is Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day or whatever, but I guess that's not politically correct anymore. So whatever. I just enjoy the day off. But I decided to get some more content in, so that's basically what I'm going to do. But I also got the Raiders game going on in the background, so I'm going to be watching it. But I'm going to do some more current events stuff. Hopefully I won't be too too distracted because my Raiders are now down and the Chiefs are mounting a comeback. So when I get into my sports content, I'll cover that kind of stuff later, and I'll probably do live games and stuff like that in the future. But for now, I actually want to get into an interesting story. And I'm going to start with the Daily Wire because I actually want to give an example of how I'm going to deviate from the way that this is being covered by super biased sources on both the left and the right. So I'm going to start with the right, with the Daily Wire. It's clearly a right-leaning source. So to kind of set this up, I want to make sure I properly contextualize this. And part of the reason why I don't want to cover it in these uber biased ways is because I actually had to do a lot of research to kind of undo, I think, the negative impacts of those biases, which I had to properly contextualize this to understand what the heck was even going on. So the headline reads, the salacious headline, that's the clickbait, reads, woke Planned Parenthood doctor claims men can have babies. GOP congressman levels him. So, and I saw the clip too that kind of went along with this. And so there was some kind of what I perceived as a congressional or Senate hearing. I'm going to say more about what it actually was later, but it's clear that it's some kind of government hearing. And then it's, apparently the doctor in question, whose photo you can see right here, is from Planned Parenthood. And he said the thing that all of the people right of center regard as uber stupid, and how could these doctors and professionals say these uber stupid things? This is a brainchild of wokeness. This is a sign that our country is going to hell in a handbasket, all that kind of stuff. So it has all of those kind of presuppositions built into it. But I actually was curious. I actually wanted to know, like, what was the actual context for this? And it turns out that there is a subcommittee of the House of Representatives called the Committee on Oversight and Reform. And it is headed by Chairman Carolyn B. Maloney. And they had a hearing, and that hearing was all about examining the harm to patients from abortion restrictions and the threat of national abortion ban. So in a nutshell, there's about 15 states out of the 50 in the union. So 15 out of 50, that have some kind of abortion ban in place right now. And this subcommittee took on the task of examining the potential harms to patients from these kinds of restrictions in the country. And they brought in, and this is kind of typical of these kinds of hearings, they brought in sorry, people calling me. They brought in, people to give official testimony, experts, people who would be able to inform this kind of evaluation. And so subcommittees are tasked with doing this regularly, for those who don't know, to the layperson. And I actually kind of knew that, but I had to kind of like do a little bit more into it. So in the context of this, there was somebody who was in fact from Planned Parenthood. He's a self-proclaimed, but he was called to give his testimony in his official capacity as a doctor about some of the issues that these abortion bans are causing various different people. And in general, I think that this kind of practice in our government is a good thing, because you want to be able to have some pathway for people to get a redress for grievances. And if people have legitimate grievances, then you want to be able to have them redressed. And so you want to be able to have expert testimony to the whatever extent that expert testimony can inform problems that are going on and blind spots that our legislators have, because clearly our legislators aren't experts in everything. And so they make legislation with respect to things that have all kinds of unintended consequences all the time. And so having subcommittees whose job it is to like fact find and inform what the impact of our legislation is going to be makes sense. And so that's kind of the proper context for this. And if you're a layperson, if you're not really aware that these kinds of things happen regularly, I just wanted to kind of give that brief background. Okay, now all of that context is kind of stripped away with this kind of headline. The headline is focusing in on something that's not really the proper focus of the purpose of the subcommittee. But in the context of that subcommittee, this dude said the thing that the Republicans regard as, cockamamie, woke, radical, whatever. Okay. Now, what I want to do is to either further properly contextualize this, I actually want to show in its entirety, and it's about 7 minutes or so, the full testimony of this doctor. This was the part that I'm going to show you is not the part that's being referred to by that headline, where he said the thing that Republicans don't like. But I want to hear kind of the redress of grievance that he's trying to speak to, or the issue or the problem that he's going to speak to in his official capacity. That's why he was called to give testimony there. And then a whole bunch of representatives are going to be able to ask him and other people questions. And so we're going to get into the kind of shit show that becomes later on, because we're going to hone in on this one segment that is being talked about and has made headlines. And I'm going to give my take on it. Heads up, sorry to I don't want to bury the lead, but like my take is going to be pretty milquetoast. I'm going to disagree with both sides on this one, at least with the extremes on both sides. It's the nature of being a moderate. I'm unapologetic about it. But I want to show you his testimony in its entirety right now. Take a look.
Dr. Kumar, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairwoman Maloney, Representative Homer, thank you for the opportunity.
You need your microphone.
Your microphone.
Chairwoman Maloney, Representative Comer, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. My name is Dr. Babak Kumar, and I use he, him pronouns. I grew up in Corsicana, Texas, where my family moved when I was 10. I know what it's like to be undocumented, a person of color, gay, and governed by white supremacist laws that burden our families and communities. I decided to become a doctor because I believe that everyone deserves quality health care. As I've provided abortion care in Texas for over 7 years, I've witnessed the steady erosion of our rights and freedoms at the hands of anti-abortion politicians. On September 1st, 2021, SB 8 banned abortion in Texas at about 6 weeks, before many people even know they're pregnant. Less than a year later, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, allowing states like Texas to completely outlaw abortion. At this moment, America is effectively two countries, one where people can control their own bodies, and another where politicians have decided for them. I've met, sat with, and cared for thousands of people who know it's not the right time for them to be pregnant. Unlike the people who pass abortion bans or uphold them in court, I actually have to face those who are harmed. I have to look my patients in their eyes, listen to them beg for help, and tell them I'm not legally allowed to take care of them. These are real people with real lives and real stories. It's an honor and a privilege to hear them. As lawmakers, it's your obligation to, with the devastating consequences of abortion bans, for my patients and your constituents. It's your duty to hear their stories too. Before Roe was overturned, when we were still providing abortion care under SB 8, I saw a patient afraid her abusive partner would find out she was pregnant. She was sure she'd made it to the clinic in time to get an abortion. She hadn't. She barely made it to the clinic that day without her partner finding out. Going out of state was unthinkable. She sobbed so loudly, people could hear her in the waiting room. Her fate was sealed. She was sentenced by the state to carry that pregnancy to term, tethered to her abusive partner to likely endure more abuse. These stories are endless. Rape, incest, young girls still learning about their bodies, mothers juggling multiple jobs and kids, college students with their whole lives ahead of them, trans folks who thought they couldn't get pregnant, people with wanted pregnancies where something went gravely wrong, people extremely sick from pregnancy who came in clutching IV poles, and on and on and on. Over and over again, we are forced to violate our conscience and our training to turn away patients who need us. There's nothing more inhumane, cruel, or unethical than having to deny people the essential health care they seek in their time of need. Now, as providers in Texas, our scope of practice is limited by the law. Texas has 3 overlapping abortion bans that carry severe punishments for providers like me, including life in prison, unless it's a medical emergency, something the law fails to adequately define because it was written by politicians and not doctors. Doctors have to wait to intervene. People have already been denied the care they need, even for early pregnancy loss, commonly known as miscarriage, because they weren't sick enough yet, not bleeding enough yet, not miscarrying enough yet. All this in a state with extremely high maternal mortality rates, especially for Black women, who are already 3 times more likely to die during childbirth. Abortion bans are inherently racist, inherently classist, and fundamentally part of the white supremacy agenda. We don't have to imagine a world where people face the deadly consequences of being denied essential medical care. It's here, and we should be ashamed. But it doesn't have to be this way. You are all in a position to act. Please be creative, be bold, and do something. Act like people's lives depend on you, because they do. I will never stop fighting for my patients, for their own bodies without political interference, and for my ability to provide them with the best medical care I can. I will show up for them with the dignity and respect that they deserve and that their government has denied them. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
I wanted you guys to hear that uninterrupted because I wanted you guys to get a sense, apart from my take and my commentary, of the kind of issues that this doctor of a certain political persuasion, which I think is obvious, he obviously leans left of center. He evoked a lot of language that is typically used by more progressive woke types. I think it's fair to consider him left-leaning or liberal, even though he hails from Texas and I think operates, he gives medical care in his official capacity as a doctor, pertaining to abortions and things like that, in Texas, as he stated. Now, what I want to model here, and what this is kind of like what I do is, wherever you stand on the issue, right? Like the goal here isn't necessarily to convince you to become pro-life or pro-choice or anything like that with respect to the abortion debate. The goal here is really to maximize the opportunity for people of whatever perspective to at least understand the perspective that is being shared here. Whether you agree with it or not is relevant. And typically, if you agree with it, it tends to motivate understanding in a way where you probably won't need much help. But if you disagree with it vehemently, I find that those are usually the situations in which it's probably the most useful to do explaining. And not in a condescending way of like finger wagging of like, you're so dumb to get this thing and that's why you're getting it wrong because you're not smart enough or you're being stupid or whatever. It's more like, I just genuinely want to make sure that everybody understands. So clearly, those who are, in favor of abortion to whatever extent that they are, and this is typical of people left of center, any kind of restrictions on abortion is viewed as backward, is viewed as repressive, oppressive, regressive. It's viewed as being motivated by religious presuppositions, which are kooky and cockamamie. So this is the kind of like milieu that is viewed with. And to steelman it somewhat, from the point of view of those typically left of center, the progressive types, they view abortion as healthcare, basically. And so the abortion procedure is just a procedure like any other medical procedure that a certain segment of the population needs, i.e., women who are pregnant and don't want to be. And so here's a procedure, and there's all kinds of things that go along with that procedure, all kinds of drugs and things like that. And there's a whole bunch of substantive restrictions against those procedures and the relevant drugs that are associated with those procedures, that are motivated by essentially preventing people from undergoing those procedures, the procedure itself being the abortion procedure. Now, one of the reasons why people want to do that is because they fundamentally perceive that procedure as entailing the murder of an unborn child. And they view their actions of prohibiting that kind of thing as motivated by protecting the life or defending the life of that unborn child, which otherwise would not even get a chance to exist because of this procedure. So from the point of view of those typically right of center, people who are against abortion, it's not just a medical procedure. This medical procedure is particularly pernicious from their point of view because it involves something pernicious, which they fundamentally see as murder or akin to murder of a fetus or an unborn child. Okay. Now, I'm not here to settle the and in fact, full transparency, I'm actually extremely ambivalent on this because I actually think it's a moral conundrum. It's not obvious to me which side is right, and there's validity on both sides, and I genuinely feel that way. My stance or my ambivalence on abortion annoys people who are certain, either on the pro-life side or on the pro-choice side, that their side is correct and the other side is morally reprehensible, if not also wrong. But like, it just isn't obvious to me, on the one hand, whether or not a human entity of some kind, if you prefer, I don't like using clump of cells because again, it's not really clear what we're talking about. So like that, like if it is the kind of thing worthy of the same kinds of protections as any other living human being, then there's something inherently dehumanizing about referring to it as a clump of cells or something like a fetus. But whatever you want to call it, an unborn child, a fetus, the unborn, I use terms like that. I'm trying to be neutral here. What is the moral status of the unborn? Exactly. To what extent, if any, do we owe the unborn similar or the same kinds of protections that we owe other human beings? It's no less human just because it's not born yet. And every single human being who is alive today once was a clump of cells, if you prefer that terminology. It doesn't really settle the question of to what, if anything, we owe the unborn. And it ain't obvious that somehow at 26 weeks, all of a sudden we owe this unborn entity rights that we didn't owe it a week earlier. So to what do we owe the unborn? And that's actually a deep philosophical question. And I don't know the answers. On the other hand, I do see I genuinely agree with the leftist types when it comes to the conundrum of restricting abortion, because that necessarily involves the government using the full weight of the government in the same way that any enforced laws entail the full weight of the government to restrict the kinds of decisions that a woman can make with respect to her own body. And it's not obvious whether or not that constitutes a violation of the relevant woman's bodily autonomy. How legitimate is it that the government step in and tell a woman what she can and can't do with respect to her own body? And yes, it does involve the unborn, but because of the nature of pregnancy and how intimately connected an unborn child is with the relevant woman in question, it still entails questions having to do with what the proper limits are when it comes to respecting the bodily autonomy of persons generally and women in particular. That's a conundrum. It's a profound conundrum. And so my ambivalence is motivated or is the product of my recognition of all of those things on either side. And those things are the different things that I just went over are emphasized on either side to make the case, pro-life, pro-choice. But this is a pickle. And I've gone back and forth about this for decades at this point, 35 years old. I've been thinking about this for a long time. And the answer still isn't obvious to me. So I wanted to be transparent about where I stand on it, but I think my ambivalence makes it easier for me to recognize both sides of it and to be neutral in a fairly genuine way. I'm not being neutral just for the sake of appearing neutral. I'm actually genuinely in the middle on this one. I'm on the fence. It's actually difficult. This is a literal moral conundrum here, and a political one at that. So with all that said, there's a lot of political back and forth that is pronounced and manifest in virtue of this conundrum that I tried to articulate as clearly as I could and as neutrally as I could. So you have a doctor from Texas. It's a gay person. It's a progressive person, and they have a certain kind of fundamental set of core beliefs with respect to what they're doing and the good that they're providing to people. They essentially regard themselves as providing medical care to people in need of it, and that's the kind of attitude you would want medical professionals to have in general. And there is a framing, or there is a point of view where that actually does make sense. If you fundamentally view the unborn as not really requiring of rights, then the removal of unborn fetal tissue is no more morally reprehensible from this point of view, removing one's tonsils or removing one's appendix or cutting one's hair or chopping one's fingernails. Certain medical procedures are disgusting if you look at them, but they're not morally reprehensible necessarily. There's going to be blood and gore from the layperson's point of view in terms of the removal of the genetic material that would otherwise constitute the fetus or the unborn in the process, or that is what unavoidable when it comes to the process of the abortion procedure. But there's all kinds of, like, if you were to see an appendix being removed, there would be all kinds of blood and gore that might make you sick. Or if you were to see all kinds of surgical procedures. I had my ACL reconstructed when I was in high school. And I'm sure if you would have watched that procedure to the layperson with an uneasy stomach, you probably would have saw it was as disgusting. But you wouldn't necessarily regard it as morally reprehensible, though. And part of why is because I don't think that we would regard, well, probably a medical procedure that entailed the removal of genetic material might be a lot better. But a better example to be more akin to this. But like, we wouldn't necessarily regard it as reprehensible. And part of that is probably because we wouldn't regard the removal of that genetic material as us owing anything, morally speaking, to that genetic material that's being removed, from tonsils to the appendix, to a tumor, etc. But when it comes to an abortion procedure, it's actually an open question to what extent there's something morally relevant that's different there. But fundamentally, I think doctors such as the one that we just saw, they don't think of themselves as doing anything morally reprehensible. They think of themselves as doing something morally just, because they're providing health care at the end of the day. Okay, so you don't have to agree with it. You can disagree with it, and I think that there are rational grounds to disagree with it. And I tried to articulate how one might do that, but I wanted to be as fair as possible to those coming from a different perspective, those coming from the perspective that this stereotypically left of center, which is that abortion is basically just healthcare, and depriving women in particular of healthcare, particularly those who are especially vulnerable and who are in dire need of it, right? If you understand it that way with those presuppositions, then it's easier to understand the argument that was basically given, which is that this is cruel, this is morally reprehensible, we should not do this. That forms the basis of a grievance claim being made on behalf of all of the women in question who are seeking abortions in these restrictive states who cannot get them. Okay. Now, so the abortion debate is one thing. Headlines like the one that I showed from the Daily Wire, and I'm going to show it again, are honing in on a particular like moment in this 3-hour long committee hearing, where the left-leaning doctor, the quote unquote woke Planned Parenthood doctor, claims this claim that is regarded generally by people right of center to be kooky, woke, radical, etc., nonsensical, all of that stuff. It's viewed pejoratively. Okay. I don't like this kind of coverage because it left so much out in terms of the context of what was happening, why this doctor was there, what the nature of this doctor's like positions were, why they think what they think. And covering those things, I think, are quintessential to our discourse and make our discourse more useful. Because what I think the primary utility of entering into public discourse even is in a society such as ours is that we want to be as informed as possible about all of the sides of any particular view so that we can come to some kind of consensus, informed consensus. That's the ultimate aim. And we're less able to do that if we get bogged down by a bunch of stupid, petty shit that doesn't really serve our ability to be able to come to an informed consensus. And I think that the Daily Wire is guilty of that kind of thing in this instance. And I'm going to bring up some left-leaning sources that are also guilty of it. And the more that we get bogged down and marred in this culture war, the more examples of that kind of thing I can provide. By the way, side note, I'm sipping on Blue Moon with a little bit of orange juice in it. Fire. But anyway, so now what I want to do is I want to get into what prompted Young Turks to hone in on this piece and get embroiled in this kind of culture war thing, which I think in some sense misses the point of the hearing and misses kind of the point of the particular topic in our discourse, which is fundamentally the abortion debate and by extension, what the political and social fallout of the overturning of Roe v. Wade are going to be, and the subsequent restrictions on abortion that have gone into effect in about 15 states in the union. And you have Republican members of the subcommittee who are going to defend that in various ways. We're going to listen to one, and then you have Democrat ones who are going to object to it in various ways. And a lot of it stems from the kind of core issue that I tried to articulate as clearly as I could. But there are a lot of kind of ripple effects that they're trying to contend with. And we're kind of in the process of elucidating those things. Okay. So the next step that I want to do is I want to hone in on one of the representatives who got into an exchange with the doctor whose testimony I showed you first. And this representative is going to be put in the crosshairs of the Young Turks. And he, Representative Andrew Clyde, and I forget what state he's from. But he's going to get put in the crosshairs of the Young Turks because they're going to object basically to his exchange with this doctor as he kind of attempts to expose the doctor for the thing that is regarded generally by conservatives to be kooky, cockamamie, absurd, dumb, woke, radical. And that's the idea that men can get pregnant. Right. And that's part and parcel of the kind of trans ideology, gender ideology. So here's an overlap. And again, this is in the context of something that's really the central focus is actually abortion and that debate. But there's an overlap, a quasi overlap here with other things having to do with gender ideology in the country. And so what I want to do is I want to start by kind of trying to articulate as neutrally as I can kind of the nature of that debate. So you have people typically left of center who believe that gender is a social construct, among other things. And when it comes to trans and non-binary people, the fundamental contention is that you have people for whom fitting into the gender non-binary is not something that they're amenable to. It's not something that comes natural to them. And indeed, to force them to conform to that would in some sense be oppressive. Because gender is a social construct after all. And so it's a matter or a function of the ways that we organize our society and not a function of what things are. biological determinism is the idea that one's biology determines one's gender, and this is viewed as oppressive in various different ways, because the contention of people who believe this is that actually, in fact, gender doesn't work that way. Gender is actually a social construct. It's not biologically determined whatsoever, and the idea that it is actually the socially constructed or made up idea of those in power to be able to force people or form a kind of basis or false pretense, let's say, to force people into certain categories that we can build all kinds of social hierarchies on and then justify our oppression of people. People like this typically believe such cynical things or analogous cynical things when it comes to racial categories as well. Although, ironically, even though race is regarded as a social construct by these types of people, for some reason, one cannot be transracial. It's not clear why exactly. Every time I ask that question, I get called names, but like, it's actually not clear why one couldn't have an analogous form of dysphoria with respect to one's racial identity as they do with respect to one's gender identity. It's not obvious why that can't happen. It's not obvious why Rachel Dolezal isn't really a black person trapped in a white person's body, exactly, which would be roughly an analogous claim to the types of claims that trans and non-binary people make. It's not obvious why race isn't a matter of feelings in the same way that gender is a matter of one's feelings, so it's subjective conception of oneself, insofar as they're both socially constructed. It's not clear why they're being treated differently, and some think that forms the basis of a double standard. I will remain neutral for the present purposes. The only point I'm trying to make, I'm not trying to really decide the matter, and I do have an opinion on that one. I'm not ambivalent on that one, to be fair. I think that shit's batshit crazy. I think that people who genuinely believe that men can be women and women can be men by fiat are woke-tarded. That's my official opinion, but for the purposes of presenting, I will, neutrally. I will remain neutral for the present purpose. I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to act like I know the right answers, and perhaps my view is wrong, for whatever that's worth. But like, there's that whole thing going on. People right of center stereotypically believe that this is all a bunch of hogwash, and that what fundamentally determines whether you are a man or a woman has everything to do with one's biology and one's anatomy. Okay. Now, it's interesting what those kind of people would say when it comes to the rare cases of people who are intersex, because it does introduce some genuine ambiguity with respect to these hard, fast biological categories. And a lot of people who don't agree with this and who are more of the left-leaning types, as I tried to describe them, would cite that as potentially an undermining thing when it comes to these hard, fast biological categories, right? Like, if you don't know what to do when you have these rare but genuinely ambiguous cases of categorization, right, then at least it gives some credence to the idea that we may be miscategorizing people, or our understanding of these biological categories may be in some sense subpar. And what's at stake is the humanity of people. We like if you don't know how to categorize an intersex person, doesn't that call into question the robustness of your biological categories? And doesn't that in some sense upend your confidence in your biological determinism? Should a person who is intersex be forced to endure a life of insecurity and discomfort and oppression because they don't fit quite nicely into your made up biological categories? You really smart, intelligent scientist, you? And isn't science generally and historically guilty of all kinds of forms of oppression perpetrated against different groups of people? Aren't there all kinds of scientific-based atrocities that we no longer are willing to defend, but we were defending it with our full-ass chest at the time? Hasn't science been used to justify various forms of oppression throughout history? And how can we be so sure that we're not doing that again in this instant? I think those are some fair questions and some fair challenges. Nonetheless, people right of center typically do not buy the presuppositions of those who embrace what I'm going to call gender ideology that insists that men can be women and men can be women can be men and men can be women by fiat, basically, insofar as they genuinely experience gender dysphoria. That there's something about one's conception of oneself that is a part of the criteria of correctness for who counts as a man and who counts as a woman. A lot of people right of center reject that. They think that the criteria of correctness is exclusively one's biology. And they can break it all the way down to chromosomal structure. DSDs aside, what determines your maleness or your femaleness, your womanness or your manness, is your chromosomal structure and other facets of your biology. Okay, so now we have an overlay of that conflict with the fundamental conflict with abortion. And for some reason, they just kind of got warped and wrapped up in each other. So now what I want to do is I want to play for y'all what is his name? The representative that I said earlier. Sorry, let me get his name real quick because I want to be accurate. Okay, Representative Andrew Clyde and his exchange with this doctor. Go ahead and take a look right now.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Again, we are here today because of the Supreme Court's landmark and life-saving decision in the Dobbs v. Jackson case. But the truth behind why we are really here is that the Democrats want one more opportunity to place the issue of abortion front and center in the news before the November 8th elections. They somehow believe that saving innocent unborn lives is a problem, and they want to use this last session week before the elections as an opportunity to campaign on killing innocent unborn children. Dr. Verma, I see you are a fellow Georgian. Recently, gubernatorial nominee Stacey Abrams from our great state of Georgia stated, and I quote, "There is no such thing as a heartbeat at 6 weeks. It is a manufactured sound." So let me ask you, is a heartbeat at 6 weeks a manufactured sound? A yes or no will suffice.
So I want to start by just
A yes or no will
that-
suffice, ma'am. Do I need to repeat the question?
I'd love to answer your question, but like so many things in medicine, it's complex.
I don't believe it's complex, ma'am. It's a pretty simple
today.
question. Is a heartbeat at 6 weeks a manufactured sound? Yes or no?
Again, I'd love to answer your question. I need a little bit of time to do so because
Okay, all right.
so many aspects
I
of
just need a yes or
healthcare
no.
and
Is it or
life
is it not? Okay, you're not going to answer my question. All
I
right.
do provide comprehensive reproductive health care, so I take care of people.
Madam Chair, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record this study titled Role of Ultrasound in the Evaluation of First Trimester Pregnancies in the Acute Setting, which was published in Ultrasonography in 2019, in which it finds that in normal fetal development, a heartbeat is expected at or around 6 weeks.
Without objection.
Thank you. And while we're talking about science, let's talk about biology. And let's just keep it real simple, just 2 yes or no questions. And this is for Dr. Kumar. Dr. Kumar, can biological men become pregnant and give birth?
So men can have pregnancies, especially trans men.
So can biological men become pregnant and give birth? So are you saying that a biological female who identifies as a man and therefore becomes pregnant is, quote, a man? Is that what you're saying?
These questions about who can become pregnant are really missing the point. I'm here to talk
No.
about what's happening in Texas.
This is me asking a question
I'm answering
and
your
you
question.
answering. I'm asking the question, sir, not you.
Right, and I'm answering the question. Somebody with a uterus may have the capability of becoming pregnant, whether they're a woman or a man. That doesn't make a difference.
Okay, we're done.
Not
We're
every
done.
person with
This
a uterus
isn't complicated.
has the ability
Let
to
me
become
tell you, if
pregnant.
a person has
This
a
is
uterus
medicine.
and is born female, they are a woman. That is not a man, and the vast majority of the world considers that to be a woman because there are biological differences between men and women. I mean, clearly, Any high school biology class teaches that men and women have different chromosomes. Females are XX chromosome and male are XY chromosome. Can't believe it's necessary to say this, but men cannot get pregnant and cannot give birth, regardless of how they identify themselves. Why in the world would Democrats have brought in a person whose title is Director of Trans Care for an abortion hearing when only biological women can become pregnant? Dr. Kumar, in your opening statement, you said, quote, "Abortion bans are inherently racist, inherently classist, and fundamentally part of the white supremacy agenda." How do you rationalize working for Planned Parenthood, an organization founded by Margaret Sanger, someone who associated with white supremacist groups and eugenics? Margaret Sanger's entire focus was to decimate communities of color through abortion to eliminate their future generations.
You know, at a time,
How many abortions have you performed in your lifetime?
if I can answer your
No,
question,
no. How many abortions have you performed in your lifetime?
likely thousands.
Likely thousands, okay. So as a doctor yourself, do you believe you have terminated enough unborn babies to justify Margaret Sanger's beliefs and your continuance of her legacy? This is unconscionable. This is inexcusable. I'm thankful it is now criminal, and I look forward to the day when life is again respected across our entire nation. In closing, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record a copy of the United States Constitution, which, despite my Democrat colleagues' absurd claims, does not, and I repeat, does not include a constitutional right to abortion. The word abortion doesn't even exist in it. And I would also like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the Declaration of Independence, which highlights the inalienable right to life.
So ordered.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Committee members are reminded to treat all witnesses with civility and respect. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Kumar, would you like to answer the question?
Thank you. Yes. So I was going to say that I find it bewildering, and actually I'm flabbergasted at the fact that we have 17 states with abortion bans. I'm here to talk about what's going on in Texas, and I was very surprised to hear a question about Margaret Sanger. I also want to say that at Planned Parenthood, we do not stand for racism. We're happy to serve our clients that are Black and brown, and we're actually proud to do that.
So, again, I'm trying my best to play these things uninterrupted, mostly because the coverage of this that I'm going to show, I feel like makes a particular mistake that I'm trying to avoid. And I'm actually finding it challenging to do so because I have my own opinions and I have my own biases. And I'm trying not to filter this through my own understanding because my understanding is limited and prone to being wrong just as much as anybody else's is. I wanted you guys to kind of hear it for yourself, unadulterated, unedited, uncommented on. To give you an opportunity to make your own decision, and if you play this video back, you can play it back without any commentary from me. And I tried to mute myself. I'm going to give commentary now, but I wanted you to hear it kind of without the commentary first. And I'm also going to comment on other people commenting on it. So there was a lot said by Representative Clyde, and I think he's from Georgia. I think he mentioned that. If that's wrong, I apologize. But man, so he epitomizes kind of the typical Republican or conservative perception on these things. He started by asking one question to another person who I didn't start with, and actually I might play her testimony later. And that question was around the controversial statement made by Stacey Abrams. And Stacey Abrams made a claim that I actually don't think is well-founded at all. It's controversial mostly for that reason, because she said it with her whole ass chest, but she seems to be completely wrong. And one could say that counts as mis or even disinformation. But people left of center aren't checking her on that, mostly because her claim serves a kind of purpose that I think that they are in alignment with. So her claim was that the ultrasound either entailed or constituted or was a manufactured sound that was made by people who are really, really gung-ho about controlling women's bodies. Now, that is in the same spirit as the kind of thing that I tried to give voice to earlier, which is that fundamentally, a lot of these people ideologically are under the presupposition that a lot of these gender categories, racial categories, and categories of identity, so that on top of which we've built all kinds of social hierarchies on, are explicitly and intentionally designed to enable forms of oppression, to keep certain groups of people down to the benefit of other groups. And the main groups that are supposed to be the benefactors are going to be the cis white males, etc. So in kind of consistent with that kind of form of cynicism, let's say, Stacey Abrams asserted, mostly without evidence, that ultrasound, or the heartbeats, I should say, the heartbeat that is detectable at 6 weeks is manufactured. That there's something fake or false about it, misleading about it. And its intended purpose is very explicit. It's done. The manufacturing of these heartbeats is done to provide a justification that otherwise wouldn't be there for controlling women's bodies. And one of the kind of basic assumptions here is that women are the ones who are historically subjugated and marginalized by men. And that men are really, really gung-ho, particularly cis het men and white men, are really, really gung-ho about controlling women's bodies. And that seems to be like either the primary or the exclusive intent behind the manufacturing of these heartbeats. Now, there's a lot in there that's dubious, and I think obviously so, but that's the view. And all I'm trying to do is emphasize how in alignment with these kind of ideological and cynical presuppositions that is, because I think it's obviously in alignment with that. So Clyde seemed to devise his questions in such a way as to kind of call out that view, which is not really being challenged very well or very much by the left. And it was kind of a clever way to accomplish several things at once. It was to challenge that view that's being promulgated by people like Stacey Abrams, calling out, drawing media attention to it, and then saddling those who are ideologically, at least, in alignment with people like her, and therefore are guilty by association with people like Stacey Abrams of this cockamamie, wild ridiculousness. That seemed to be the spirit of what he did, and I am in some sense being presumptive, but I would presume or assume that was kind of the goal. So he started with that question. Then he came to the doctor that I introduced you, Dr. Kumar, and he asked that doctor another loaded question. It was loaded in the sense that it seemed to be purposed to expose something. Whether or not it did so in a intellectually honest way, I'll leave up to you. But it seemed designed to kind of associate Dr. Kumar with the same kind of radicalness that a lot of Republican conservative types dislike. And the question that he asked him is well, he asked him several questions. One of them had to do, and they were kind of rhetorical because he didn't really let him answer. One of them had to do with the association between Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger. And Margaret Sanger, I think, fairly understandably, is associated with white supremacy. Now, the irony is that the main people who are talking about white supremacy these days are the woke types, the progressive types. They're the main ones that talk that shit. So for them to be pussyfooting around Margaret Sanger's very controversial history and association with Planned Parenthood is awkward, because they're the main ones who say it with their whole ass chest. And he was one of the main ones that brought up the whole the fact that in 17 states that I think he cited, that there are abortion bans, that this is somehow, a part of the white supremacist agenda. He even exemplified kind of being, speaking in that vein in here. And so the kind of clapback from Clyde was that it's interesting that you say that, because you work for Planned Parenthood, and Planned Parenthood was established by somebody with white supremacist intent and who was really gung-ho about, from the point of view of a Republican type, killing black babies in the womb. What could be more white supremacist than infanticide writ large? What could be more white supremacist than systematizing the murder of black babies in the womb and masking it as compassion? That seemed to be the point he was trying to make. And he did it in the form of like pretending to ask questions. I don't really think he cared about the answers. I think the questions were accusatory in nature. I think the questions were designed to make Dr. Kumar look bad. But what I want to do is I want to get beneath the kind of political theater and get at kind of what's going on beneath the surface, which is there's a lot of competing philosophical and ideological presuppositions going on between people on the right and people on the left. For sure, I think that's obvious. But what's not so obvious is maybe what they are and then the elaborations of them. So I'm trying to do that now. Now, people left of center are going to object to this kind of thing because they're going to perceive fundamentally what Clyde did is inherently intellectually dishonest. He's not really getting at the truth. But what you have to keep in mind about that is there are competing truth claims here, and they're competing starting presuppositions here. So it would make more sense why a person left of center would not regard Clyde as being honest or truthful, given the philosophical presuppositions that they start with. It would also make sense why somebody like Clyde or a more conservative Republican-leaning person would regard the kinds of responses that were given by both of the people who were given their testimony as in some sense dissonant in their philosophical presuppositions as well. And one of the things that I want to highlight is you could say that Dr. Kumar and the other lady who was asked the question actually really answered their questions. They didn't really answer them directly. The first lady implied that there was something more complicated than the question would allow. So she was trying to answer it in a long-winded way, not in a yes or no way. And he was prompting her to answer it in a yes or no way. Your views around whether or not the question was fair are even going to be determined by the philosophical starting points that you start with, to be honest. Right? Like, was that a fair yes or no question? Or was it, in fact, more complicated than the question implied? And should he have allowed her, even though he was only given about 5 minutes worth of speaking time to ask questions in the first place, to pontificate potentially endlessly and not allow him to get out the other questions that he strategically wanted to ask the other person to make them look bad for political reasons? I'll leave that up to you to decide. In my opinion, I don't think she answered the question, and I don't know that the question required any kind of elaborate answer, or at least she could have started by answering yes or no and then going to elaborate and specify why it was in some sense not an adequate question. I think that would have been probably sufficed. It's not obvious to me why she couldn't have answered that question. Is it true or is it not true that the heartbeat that is detected by ultrasound is manufactured in any sense? I don't know why that can't be answered yes or no. Maybe people can leave it in the comments and specify why there's more, where there's something more complicated going on there. I don't know. Maybe there is. I don't know how ultrasound works, but I feel like the whether or not that is manufactured is a fundamental question. It's a basic question. But maybe that's a product of my ignorance. I don't know. And then the other question about whether or not Dr. Kumar thought that men could get pregnant. I don't know why he couldn't just answer that straightforward. He seemed to be deflecting from those questions too. And I think that on some level, both doctors were aware that answering the question straightforwardly made them look bad, or stood to make them look bad. I'm pretty sure both doctors were aware of that. And that's one of the reasons why I think that people in those positions, given the kinds of indefensible positions that I think a lot of them try to defend, don't answer basic and fair questions straight away in general. Now, whether or not you think these are basic and fair questions, again, I'll leave that up to you. But if they in fact were, it would make sense why a person who's trying to maintain an untenable position, that those questions are cleverly devised to expose as untenable, wouldn't answer them. And I think that's what Clyde thought of himself as doing. I think that what a lot of Republicans thought of him as doing. I think that there may be some fair criticism about the way in which Clyde went about asking questions, but if you take into account the fact that he only had about 5 minutes to ask any questions, then I don't know. It's not long form. These committee hearings, the amount of questions that they have, or excuse me, the amount of time they have to ask questions is not that long. I've seen a lot of these committee hearings before, so I understand that they don't have that much time. And then there's the person who keeps track of time and tells them when they run out of time. And you're going to see that actually when AOC claps back against Clyde, kind of. And then we're going to talk about, I'm probably going to do a part 2. We're going to talk about TYT's reaction to this entire exchange and where some of their criticisms are fair and where some of their criticisms, I think, go awry and don't make any sense. At the end of the day, there's a lot of back and forth going on and a lot of talking past each other going on in our political discourse. And that's really the main focus of what I'm doing right now, is that I want to highlight that, because I think that there is a potential huge fallout in the landscape of our politics and the disarray that our society is going to fall into if this continues unabated. People need to do a better job of understanding all sides of issues and not kowtowing and walking the line and staying on code and being hyper fucking partisan and tribalistic. These are very complex issues that we're trying to deal with. And there are legitimate grievances that people have on both sides. It's not just the Republicans who have legitimate grievances and worries. It's not just the Democrats who have legitimate grievances and worries. And we would do well to recognize that. But the mode of engagement that is fairly consistent from our politicians, from those in the media, from those in independent media as well as legacy media, that ain't it. So with that, I'm going to try to find that clip that I have of AOC. It'll take me 1 second. And then I'm going to let you hear her response and how she kind of clapped back. And I'm going to keep my comments until after, because I want you to hear it kind of and make your own judgment.
Woman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is now recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I think briefly, I'd like to address some of the prior claims that, several prior immediate claims, one being that abortion is not an economic issue and that we should be focused on economic issues. And I also, I think it's important to state that that abortion is an economic issue. Forcing poor and working class people to give birth against their will, against their consent, against their ability to provide for themselves or a child is a profound economic issue. And it's certainly a way to keep a workforce basically conscripted to large-scale employers and to employers to work more against their will, to take second and third jobs against their desire and their own autonomy. And so the idea that that abortion and access to abortion is somehow not a profound and central economic and class issue and class struggle is certainly something that I think a person who's never had to contend with the ability to carry a child, it belies that perspective. And it's disappointing to see. But secondly, I think another thing that I'd like to address is that the same folks who tell us and told us that COVID's just a flu, that climate change isn't real, that January 6th was nothing but a tourist visit, are now trying to tell us that transgender people are not real. And I would say that their claim is probably just as legitimate as all their others, which is to say, not very much at all. But moving forward, Dr. Kumar, are you able to tell me what methotrexate and what conditions that methotrexate is routinely prescribed for?
Sure. Methotrexate has a number of different uses. It can be used to treat ectopic pregnancies, atopic dermatitis, lupus, and there's several other conditions that it can be used for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe it's can also be used to treat cancer. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I believe you said rheumatoid arthritis as well?
Yes.
And they can also be prescribed in the event of an abortion, correct?
Right. It can be used for ectopic pregnancies. It has been used in the past for intrauterine pregnancies, even though that's rare now.
Mm-hmm. And so, what we see here is that this is one drug that has many different applications depending on the condition, which is common for many other medications as well. High blood pressure can also treat other, medications for high blood pressure can also treat other conditions as well. And so what we're seeing here is that many of these these anti-abortion laws, these forced birth laws, are written by legislators that really have very little clue into the nuances of medical care. In fact, Texas has designated methotrexate as an abortion-inducing drug. And now those same people who have cancer, arthritis, and lupus have to prove that they are not using those medications for abortion, which then, of course, delves into gross violation of privacy issues that create real conflicts for people. Is this something that you are seeing, Dr. Kumar?
Yes, certainly. I've heard from people in Texas who have been using methotrexate for other medical conditions, and they're not able to access it at the pharmacy. Some people have also gone to the pharmacy to get their medication and been asked about pregnancy test or about if they're using any kind of contraception, which again is a violation of their privacy and shouldn't be asked. They've been getting these medications for some time.
Thank you. And, I think I'd like to walk through a little bit of a thought experiment or even a scenario in the small amount of time that I have left. I, for example, since Republicans are forcing this conversation in uncomfortable ways, then I will meet them to it. I have an IUD. I've had one for years. Now, IUDs, if an IUD fails and results in an ectopic pregnancy, which has about a 50% chance, I believe, of an ectopic pregnancy emerging with an IUD, would that mean that if I were hospitalized in these states, you would have to wait until I was in the process, potentially, of actively dying before you could effectively treat me and save my or anyone in our position's life?
So thank you for that question. I think this came up earlier around ectopic pregnancies. To date, and to my knowledge, there are no laws that outlaw care for ectopic pregnancies. However, what we've seen in Texas, because these laws are written by politicians and sometimes don't make sense and are difficult to grapple with and understand by physicians who are practicing medicine, we have seen people denied access to that care. And I've actually seen somebody in Texas who left the state to get care for her ectopic pregnancies. So it's very possible. It depends on which healthcare provider you see, which clinic or hospital you may go to, because we're interpreting these laws in real time by physicians.
And that's exactly the problem, right? Is that doctors are now having to interpret law.
That's
correct. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back.
Okay, so you saw kind of uninterrupted kind of AOC's testimony, and it included more than just a clapback, not only of Clyde, but of other, I think, Republicans that went after him, but before her. I think there was maybe one or two. So she kind of set up everything by basically comparing the nature of the either implied claims or the explicitly stated claims that were in clear opposition to the typical pro-abortion, pro-trans and gender ideology positions that Democrats in general and progressives in particular embrace, as just as dubious or just as inaccurate as other claims that progressive types associate with Republicans, and for good reason, because Republicans do say things like this. She attributed to them, I think, slightly unfairly, the idea that trans people aren't real. There's a reading of that phrase that I think is actually fair to attribute to most conservative types, and then there's a reading of that that's not fair. And I just think that that's what's weird about that choice of words, is that it can be made more clear and it can be made more accurate. But progressives don't bother, and I think that, well, my suspicion is that phrasing that could be misinterpreted, like it's purposeful that it's being used that way, because I think they want the misunderstanding. I think they want to exaggerate and make it seem like Republicans think things that generally they don't think. I think that you can find people right of center who do think that, the more extreme version, but I don't know the vast majority of them do. I don't know what they think about the ontological status of trans people. It would be weird for the vast majority of Republicans to say that trans people don't exist. And by that, what they mean is, like, the ontologic, like there's no ontology to them, like they're like the boogeyman or Santa Claus. It's more accurate to say that what they typically think is not anything to do about the ontology of trans people, but more that the claims that the trans people make with respect to their own gender identities are false. And so they're not really what they say that they are. That would be more accurate. And you can object to that, but I feel like that would be a more accurate thing to attribute to them than the other thing, which is weird. You're making it seem like trans people don't exist. It's like you're ignoring their ontology. It's like, I don't think that's what trans people actually think. Conservatives actually think about trans people or non-binary people. But anyway, and I'm going to get into that more in a second. But the other thing that AOC did was she brought up, I think, a more substantive issue. And she had a limited amount of time as well. And I think she tried to give voice to something that I think is actually really interesting, and that I think that people right of center need to contend with. And that is that the ways in which these abortion bans generally, and the ones specifically in Texas, have been done, is that they are banning forms of medication that are commonly used in the abortion procedure, but that can also be used in other procedures that have nothing to do with abortion. And so to whatever extent that those drugs could be served to help people that have nothing to do with abortion, it's making it more difficult for those patients to receive those, because they have to go through a whole bunch of extra hoops as a direct consequence of these laws. That might have implications for their healthcare providers and the costs associated with them. That might have implications for whether or not the particular clinics that they go to even offer them anymore. Because what a lot of doctors and a lot of practitioners are trying to do is avoid legal liabilities. And so they may cease to offer them entirely, even though they're not legally required to, because the penalties potentially for them having a misstep with respect to the law might result in them being sued, or something, some kind of legally actionable thing that undermines their entire practice. And I think that that's actually like something that's fair to discuss. Like that's something that I think is a legitimate concern. No matter where you lean, you need to address that. And so that to me is a matter, and because our discourse is so tribal and like overly simplistic, we get into the nuances as a culture. You know what I mean? Like people like the Daily, like publications like the Daily Wire are honing in on the fact that the doctor said the weird thing that they disagree with. And people left of center are overly focused on the fact that Clyde said the anti-woke thing and the transphobic thing and should be canceled, or whatever they think should happen to him. And see this is proof that people hate like Republicans hate trans people. They hate them. And we're going to get more into that with TYT's coverage of that. But like that's what we get. Like that's the coverage. Like it's overly focused narrowly and myopically on these petulant, like tribalistic things, and it's not focused on like the nitty gritty. And part of what I want to do is I want to advocate that we have a more mature discussion about these things. We can address the more petulant stuff too, but don't prioritize it over all of the substantive stuff. Like that's annoying. I just wish we couldn't. I just wish we lived in a world where we didn't have to do that shit. We have to deal with that shit on a regular basis. That's it. I'm gonna pause here, but then the next time I come back, I'm actually going to get into the TYT's coverage of this. But I wanted to spend a lot of time unpacking all of the nuance, or at least a lot of it, all of the context, or at least a lot of it, in a way that I don't think the Young Turks does very well, and I don't think that publications like the Daily Wire and other right-leaning publications that have covered this have done very well. They're extracting the salaciousness out of it, using that to get clicks, likes, subs, and dollars for their advertisers, and not really speaking substantively to the issues and all the nuances of the issues, not really inviting people to be able to consider all sides of the issue. And so I want to be, in some sense, a counter to that. Maybe I'm not the best counter to that, but I want to, in some sense, be a counter to that. So until next time, peace.